Imagine sitting at a simple wooden table in a small medieval home as the day slowly comes to an end. The light is soft, coming from a nearby fire or a single candle. The room smells faintly of smoke, wood, and something warm, something cooking. Outside, the world is quiet. Inside, everything feels slow, steady, familiar. Food in the Middle Ages was not just something people ate. It was part of the rhythm of life, something that followed the seasons, the weather, and the limits of what was available. There were no supermarkets, no long lists of ingredients from distant places, only what could be grown, stored, or carefully prepared. As you look at the table in front of you, the meal may seem simple: a piece of bread, a bowl of something warm, perhaps a drink in a wooden cup. Nothing looks complex, nothing feels excessive. And yet, this is what most people knew every single day. In the medieval world, food was shaped not by choice, but by necessity, by what the land could provide, by what could last through the colder months, by what could be shared among families and communities. And while some meals were modest and repetitive, others, especially in larger homes or important gatherings, could be surprisingly elaborate, full of unfamiliar combinations, unusual textures, and ingredients that might feel unexpected today. But even then, everything followed a certain rhythm, simple, predictable, and deeply connected to everyday life. Tonight, we'll gently explore what people actually ate in the Middle Ages, from the most basic meals to the more unusual dishes that appeared across different parts of society. A quiet journey into food, not as something fast or modern, but as something slow, practical, and shaped by the world around it. So take a moment to relax, settle into the calm atmosphere, and imagine yourself sitting at that wooden table as the evening meal begins. As the evening meal begins and you sit at the wooden table, one thing quickly becomes clear. Food in the Middle Ages was not built around variety. It was built around consistency, and at the center of that consistency was bread. Bread was not just a part of the meal, it was the meal. As you imagine reaching for a piece, you notice its texture immediately. It is firm, slightly rough, sometimes darker in color depending on the grain used. Not soft like modern bread, not light or airy, but dense, filling, made to last. Different types of bread existed, but most people ate what they could afford. For many, this meant bread made from grains like rye or barley, simple, practical, and available. Wheat bread, softer and lighter, was less common and often reserved for those who could access better ingredients. But, no matter the type, bread was present at nearly every meal. It could be eaten on its own, used to scoop food, or even serve as part of the table itself. In some cases, thick slices of bread were used almost like plates, holding food, absorbing sauces, and then either eaten or set aside. Alongside bread, there was something equally important, something warm, something steady: porridge. As you look at the wooden bowl placed in front of you, you see a simple mixture. Grains cooked slowly in water or broth until they soften into a thick, smooth texture. It is not visually complex, but it is comforting. The warmth rises gently. The surface moves slightly as it settles, and when eaten, it feels steady, filling, predictable. Porridge could change slightly depending on what was available. Sometimes thicker, sometimes thinner. Occasionally with small additions, vegetables, herbs, or whatever could be found. But at its core, it remained the same. A simple, reliable source of nourishment. What makes these foods so important is not just their presence, but their consistency. day after day, meal after meal. Bread and porridge formed the foundation of daily life. They did not change often. They did not surprise. They simply existed, providing what was needed. Nothing more, nothing less. As you sit there eating slowly, you begin to understand how different this experience feels. There is no rush, no variety of dishes, no expectation of something new. Only the quiet repetition of food that is familiar. And in that familiarity, there is a certain kind of comfort, a rhythm, a sense that everything is exactly as it should be. As the simple meal of bread and porridge settles into a quiet routine, another detail of medieval life begins to take shape. Not everyone ate the same, and for most people, food was not about choice, but about survival. As you imagine stepping outside the small home and into a quieter part of the village, you begin to see how daily meals were shaped by what was available. For the majority of people, food was simple, repetitive, and deeply connected to the land. The meals of poorer households were built around what could be grown locally, gathered or stretched over time. Vegetables played an important role. Cabbage, onions, turnips. Simple ingredients that could survive in different conditions and be stored for longer periods. These were often cooked slowly, combined into soups or stews that could last for several meals. As you look into a pot hanging over a small fire, the contents are modest. A mixture of water, vegetables, and perhaps small additions depending on what was available. The texture is thin, the flavors are subtle, but the warmth is steady. And that warmth matters. Because food was not only about taste, it was about sustaining the body, providing enough energy to continue through long days of work. In many cases, meals were shared. A single pot, a single source, everyone eating together, quietly, without excess. Meat, for poorer households, was not always common. It might appear occasionally, in small amounts, often preserved or stretched across multiple meals, and because of this, each ingredient was used carefully. Nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted. As you sit with this meal, you begin to notice how different it feels. There is no variety of dishes, no separate courses, only one steady, simple meal. And yet, it is enough. Enough to continue, enough to sustain. Even the act of eating feels slower, more intentional, each bite measured. Each portion valued. And over time, this creates a different relationship with food. Not something taken for granted, but something respected, something understood as part of daily effort. As the fire burns quietly and the meal comes to an end, the space returns to stillness. The pot remains. The simple ingredients. The quiet understanding that tomorrow, the meal will likely be much the same. And in that repetition, life continues. Steady, predictable, and deeply connected to what the land can provide. As the simple meals of the village fade into the background, the atmosphere begins to change. The space becomes larger, the light softer, but more abundant, and the table itself begins to look different. As you imagine entering a larger medieval home, perhaps a hall or a well-kept residence, you begin to notice how food changes depending on where you are. Not completely, but noticeably. The table is no longer small or modest. It stretches wider, covered with cloth, holding multiple dishes instead of just one. The food itself appears more varied, more carefully arranged, more deliberate. For those with greater resources, meals were not only about nourishment, they were also about display, about showing what was available, and what could be prepared. As you look across the table, you may see different types of bread, lighter in color, softer in texture. You may notice meats prepared in various ways, placed alongside fruits, vegetables, and other ingredients that are less common in simpler homes. The colors are more varied, the presentation more intentional. But even here, everything remains grounded in the same world. There is no excess in the modern sense, no overwhelming abundance, only a wider selection of what already exists. Meat appears more frequently in these meals, prepared carefully, sometimes seasoned, sometimes combined with other ingredients to create more complex dishes. Not dramatically different, but more refined. As you imagine sitting at this table, you notice how the pace of the meal remains slow. There is no rush. Courses may be served one after another, but the movement is steady, measured. People eat, speak quietly, and remain present in the moment. There is structure here, a rhythm to how the meal unfolds. Different dishes appear, are shared, and then gradually replaced. Nothing sudden, nothing overwhelming. Even the act of serving food carries a sense of calm order. Each element has its place. Each movement feels intentional. And yet, despite the differences, something remains the same. Food is still connected to the land, still shaped by what is available, still dependent on the same seasons, the same environment, the same limitations. The difference is not in the world itself, but in how much of it can be accessed. As the meal continues, the table slowly begins to clear. The dishes are reduced. The space becomes simpler once again, and the quiet atmosphere returns. Because even in places of greater comfort, the rhythm of life remains steady, calm, unhurried, and deeply connected to the world beyond the walls. As the larger meals of wealthier households begin to fade from view, another aspect of medieval food slowly comes into focus. Not through abundance, but through variety. Because while many meals were simple and repetitive, there were also moments when food became unusual. Not in a shocking way, but in a way that feels unfamiliar today. In the Middle Ages, people often used what was available around them. Not just the common ingredients, but anything that could be prepared and eaten. As you imagine walking through a medieval kitchen, you might notice how different the approach to food feels. There is no fixed list of acceptable ingredients, no strict separation between what is normal and what is not. Instead, there is flexibility, practicality. If something could be used, it often was. This meant that meals could sometimes include meats that feel unexpected from a modern perspective. Animals that were part of the environment, prepared in ways that made them suitable for the table. But even here, everything was done with care. Not rushed, not careless. Food preparation was slow, deliberate, and often guided by tradition. Recipes were not always written down, but passed through experience, through repetition, through memory. As you look at a dish placed on a wooden table, it may not immediately appear unusual. Cooked carefully, served simply, blended with other ingredients to create something balanced and filling. What matters is not the novelty, but the usefulness. Every part of the animal could be used in some way. Nothing wasted, nothing ignored. This approach created meals that were practical, efficient, and deeply connected to the idea of using what was available. In some cases, dishes were prepared in ways that combined flavors we might not expect, mixing sweet and savory, soft and firm textures. But even then, the goal remained the same: to create something nourishing, something that could sustain. As you sit with this idea, You begin to understand that food in the Middle Ages was not guided by preference in the modern sense. It was guided by availability, by necessity, by a quiet understanding of how to make the most of what existed. And in that understanding, even the most unusual dishes felt completely normal, part of life, part of the rhythm. As the meal comes to an end and the table returns to stillness, these differences begin to fade, leaving behind a simple realization that what feels strange today once felt entirely familiar. As the meal slowly comes to an end, another small but important detail becomes clear: what people drank. At first, it might seem simple: water. But in the Middle Ages, the situation was not always so straightforward. As you imagine sitting at the table, a wooden cup placed in front of you, you notice that the liquid inside is not always plain water. Instead, it may be something else, something lightly colored, something slightly different. In many places, people often drank beverages that were gently prepared rather than taken directly from nearby sources. Not because water was never used, but because it was not always consistent in quality or taste, depending on where it came from. And so, over time, people developed other options. Simple drinks, lightly made, often prepared in a way that made them more reliable. As you lift the cup, the smell is soft. Not strong, not overwhelming, just slightly different from what you might expect. These drinks were not like modern versions. They were much lighter, more subtle, often made in ways that kept them gentle and suitable for daily use. They were part of everyday life, just as common as bread or porridge, used during meals, shared between people, a natural part of the routine. What is interesting is how these drinks fit into the same rhythm as everything else. They were not special, not occasional, but constant. Something that appeared again and again, quietly supporting daily life. Even the act of drinking feels slower, more intentional. A small pause between bites of food, a moment of rest. As you sit there holding the cup, you begin to understand how different this experience is. There are no cold, sharp flavors, no strong contrasts, only something mild, something steady. And in that simplicity, there is comfort, a sense that everything is balanced, nothing too strong, nothing too sudden, just part of the same calm flow that defines the entire meal. As the cup is set down and the table grows quiet once more, this small detail becomes part of a larger picture, a world where even the simplest things, food, drink, light, are shaped by the same steady rhythm, unhurried, practical, and quietly consistent. Imagine cutting into a piece of meat and realizing it doesn't smell quite right. Today, that would be the moment you throw it away without hesitation. But in the Middle Ages, things worked very differently. Food was not something you could afford to waste. There were no refrigerators, no safe storage, and no guarantees that your next meal would come anytime soon. So when food started to spoil, people didn't immediately see it as useless. They saw it as something that could still be saved. Meat, for example, would often begin to turn after only a short time, especially in warmer seasons. Instead of discarding it, people would try to hide the signs of spoilage. One of the most common methods was using strong spices. Heavy seasonings like pepper, cloves, and garlic weren't just about flavor. They were often used to mask unpleasant smells and tastes. A piece of meat that was no longer fresh could be cooked again, covered in spices, and served as if nothing was wrong. And in many cases, people accepted it, because they had no choice. Bread followed a similar story. Fresh bread didn't last long. Within days, it could become hard enough to break teeth. But instead of throwing it away, people found ways to reuse it. They soaked it in water, broth, or ale, until it softened again. Sometimes it was turned into thick soups or stews, becoming part of a completely new dish. Nothing was wasted. Even dairy products could reach a point where they were no longer fresh, yet still consumed. Slightly sour milk or cheese wasn't always seen as spoiled. Sometimes it was simply considered part of the normal taste. And over time, people adapted. Their senses, their expectations, even their understanding of what was good food changed. What we would immediately reject today might not have seemed unusual to them at all. Hunger played a huge role in this. For the poor especially, food was survival, not comfort. If something could still be eaten without immediate consequences, it often was. The risk was accepted because the alternative, going hungry, was worse. And this created a very different relationship with food. People became less sensitive to smells, textures, and appearances that would alarm us today. A slightly off taste wasn't always a warning sign. It was just part of daily life. So next time you hesitate over food that doesn't seem perfectly fresh, remember this. There was a time when people didn't have the luxury of being picky. They ate what they had, even when it wasn't exactly safe. As the final moments of the meal fade into quiet, the table slowly returns to stillness. The wooden bowls are nearly empty. The bread is gone. The cups rest quietly where they were set down. And once again, everything feels calm. As you look back on the different meals, the simple bread and porridge, the modest food of everyday life, the more varied dishes of larger homes, you begin to notice something deeper. Food in the Middle Ages was not about endless choice. It was about rhythm, about repetition, about understanding what was available and making it last. There were no sudden changes, no constant variety, only a steady pattern that followed the seasons, the land, and the quiet structure of daily life. Meals were simple, but they were enough. Enough to continue the day, enough to support the work that filled each hour, enough to bring people together, even in the most modest spaces. And perhaps that is what makes this world feel so different. Not the food itself, but the pace around it, the calm, the absence of urgency, the way each meal existed as part of a larger flow. As the light grows softer and the day slowly comes to an end, the table is cleared. The space returns to its quiet form, and the rhythm continues. Tomorrow, the meal will be similar, familiar, unchanged, and in that repetition, there is a certain kind of peace, a steady, simple understanding of life, shaped by what is needed and nothing more. So as this moment fades and the quiet settles in once again, you can let yourself drift with it into a slower world, where even something as simple as food follows its own calm rhythm.